The silence between us hung heavy, dense with something neither of us dared to name. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, the muted hum of the refrigerator, even the rhythm of my own breath, and even, uncertain, Ethan sat across from me, but it felt as though he were closer, his presence pulling at the invisible space between us. I told myself this was just another afternoon, that soon my son would walk through the front door, and this strange current running beneath, the moment would dissolve into nothing. But before that could happen, Ethan shifted forward in his chair, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on mine. Double quotes, Mrs. Carter, he began softly, his tone hesitant yet firm. There's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time. My stomach tightened. His words were too deliberate, too careful. Ethan, I said, my voice low, unsure whether it was a warning or an invitation. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously, but he didn't look away. You've always been different. Not just Daniel's mom. Not just someone I see when I come over. You've been important to me. I froze. My first instinct was to dismiss it, to chalk it up to teenage confusion, to laugh and change the subject. But the intensity in his eyes told me this wasn't a boy's careless flattery. This was something heavier, something that had been building, quietly beneath the surface for who knows how long. Ethan, I said gently, trying to keep my voice steady, I think you're confusing gratitude with something else. You've had a rough time at home. It makes sense you'd feel... No, he interrupted, his voice firmer now, though not unkind. This isn't about my home. It's not about missing something I don't have there. It's about you. I look forward to coming here not just because of Daniel, but because of you. The way you smile, the way you listen, the way you make people feel. You don't even realize it, but you've been the most constant, steady thing in my life. That words hit me like a wave. I sat there, stunned, unable to move, my hands gripping the edge of the couch cushion, as if it were the only solid thing left. I opened my mouth, searching for a response, but nothing came. I wasn't prepared for this. Not here, not now, not from him. And then before I could gather my thoughts, he stood. Slowly, cautiously, he crossed the small space between us. My pulse quickened, my mind screaming at me to stop this, to create distance, to restore the boundaries that had just been shattered. But my body didn't move. He stood in front of me, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. Now I shouldn't say this, he whispered, his voice trembling now, but I can't keep pretending. And then he did the thing that shocked me. He leaned down, slowly, carefully, giving me every chance to pull away, to stop him. His lips brushed against mine, light, tentative, filled with hesitation and desperation all at once. It was not the kiss of a boy experimenting. It was the kiss of someone who had thought about this, wrestled with it, feared it, and finally surrendered to it. I gasped, my eyes widening, my hands instinctively gripping his arms, not pushing him away, not yet, but holding him as if to steady the ground beneath us. The kiss lasted only a second, maybe two, but in that brief space of time, the quiet of the house, the loneliness I had felt earlier, the years of routine and sacrifice, everything collided. When he pulled back, his face was flushed, his breathing unsteady. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I shouldn't have. I couldn't hold it in anymore. My heart pounded so hard, I thought he could hear it. I stared at him, torn between disbelief and a storm of emotions I couldn't even name. Shock. Yes, but not just shock. Something deeper, more dangerous. Ethan, I managed finally, my voice shaking. Do you realize what you've just done? Do you understand how complicated this is? He nodded, his eyes shining with something raw and unguarded. I know. And I know you probably think this is crazy, or wrong, or impossible. But I needed you to know how I feel. Even if nothing ever happens, even if you never look at me the same way again, I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I looked at him, then really looked. At the boy who had grown up alongside my son, at the young man who stood before me now, caught in that liminal space between youth and adulthood. His words, his actions, they were reckless, but they were also achingly sincere. Shock wasn't just in what he had done. It was in the way it stirred something in me I hadn't expected, something I thought had long been buried under years of responsibility and routine. I drew in a shaky breath, forcing myself to steady the chaos inside me. Ethan, I said quietly, you need to leave before Daniel gets home. His expression faltered, pain flickering across his features. But he nodded, understanding. He grabbed his backpack slowly, slinging it over his shoulder, his movements heavy with regret. At the door, he paused, turning back one last time. I meant what I said, he whispered. I don't expect you to feel the same, but I don't regret telling you. And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving me alone once again in the silence of my house. But this silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of his words, the memory of his kiss, and the shocking realization that for the first time in years I didn't feel invisible. I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling, my heart still racing. I didn't know what would happen next or how I would carry this secret. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever feel the same again. The knock at the door, though ordinary, carried with it a strange heaviness. I wasn't expecting anyone, and being home alone had already sharpened my senses. For a second, I simply stood there, my hand hovering over the knob, debating whether I should open it at all. But curiosity won, and with a steadying breath, I turned the handle. When the door swung open, I was met with a familiar yet surprising face. It was Ethan, my son's closest friend. He stood there, tall and lanky, the awkward boy I had known for years, now beginning to show the confidence of a young man. His hair was slightly damp, as if he had just showered or perhaps run through the warm afternoon sun. His smile was hesitant, polite, the kind of smile that carried both respect and a quiet nervousness. Hi, Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice deeper than I remembered, a subtle reminder of how quickly time was moving. Ethan? I asked, my brows knitting in mild surprise. What are you doing here? Daniel isn't home yet. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the ground before meeting my gaze again. Yeah, I know. I was actually hoping to catch him, but I guess I'm early. I stepped aside instinctively, motioning for him to come in. Well, you might as well wait. He shouldn't be too long. Ethan stepped past me, his presence filling the quiet house in a way that felt both comforting and unsettling. The once empty silence now carried the sound of his sneakers against the hardwood floor, the faint rustle of his backpack as he set it down near the door. Thanks, he said softly, looking around as though seeing the house in a new light, closed the door behind him and turned to study him more closely. Over the years, I had seen Ethan countless times: sleepovers, game nights, trips to the park. He had always been that polite boy who called me Mom and tried not to take the last slice of pizza, even when he was starving. But today, something was different. There was a certain confidence in the way he carried himself, a maturity in his posture, though his eyes still held a hint of boyish charm. So, how was practice? I asked, moving toward the living room. Double quotes. Oh, it got cancelled, he replied, following me inside. Coach wasn't feeling well, so they sent us home early. That's why I thought I'd stop by. I nodded, settling onto the couch. He lingered for a moment before sitting in the armchair across from me. It felt strange sitting across from my son's best friend in the stillness of the afternoon, with no one else around. I tried to make conversation, if only to ease the odd tension I felt. You're growing up so fast, Ethan. I swear, every time I see you, you look taller. He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I guess I've changed a little. Then he paused, his eyes meeting mine with a seriousness I hadn't expected. And so have you. The words lingered in the air, heavier than they should have been. Compliments from teenagers were usually clumsy, casual, but this one felt deliberate. My cheeks warmed, though I brushed it off with a smile. Well, time is a way of changing all of us, I replied lightly, trying to keep the atmosphere casual. But I couldn't ignore the way his gaze lingered, the way his presence filled the quiet in a way that made me aware of myself, my posture, my breathing, even the way I tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. To distract myself, I stood. Would you like something to drink while you wait? Juice, soda. Water's fine, he said. I moved into the kitchen, grateful for the small escape. As I poured the water, I took a moment to steady myself. Why was I suddenly so flustered? This was Ethan, my son's friend, the boy who used to spill popcorn all over my living room floor during movie nights. And yet, there was something different in the air today. When I returned, I handed him the glass, and our fingers brushed, briefly. A simple, accidental touch, but one that sent an unexpected shiver through me. He muttered a quiet thanks, his eyes flicking away as though he too had felt something shift. He took a sip, then leaned back in the chair. You know, Mrs. Carter, I always liked coming here. Your house feels different, warm, safe. His words caught me off guard. Well, thank you. I'm glad you feel that way. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Sometimes it feels easier here than at my own house. There was a vulnerability in his tone, one that softened my initial unease. I knew Ethan's family situation wasn't perfect. Arguments between his parents, long absences, a kind of emotional neglect that Daniel had mentioned in passing. Perhaps that was why he had always gravitated toward our home, toward the chaos and comfort of a family that welcomed him without question. That means a lot, Ethan, I said gently. You're always welcome here. For a moment, silence settled between us again, but it wasn't the hollow silence of earlier. This one was charged, filled with unspoken thoughts and emotions I couldn't quite name. I shifted, clearing my throat. So what's new with you? College plans? Anything exciting? He smiled faintly, but there was something behind it. A lot, actually. But it feels weird talking about the future when the present still feels so unsettled. I tilted my head, studying him. Unsettled how? He hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. Like, there are things I want to say, things I want to do, but I don't always know if I should. The weight of his words pressed against me, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. Something in the way he said it felt less like a boy talking about his life and more like a young man carrying thoughts he didn't dare voice. Well, I said carefully, sometimes timing is everything. The right words at the wrong time can make things complicated. His eyes locked on mine then, intense in a way that made my breath catch. And what if the timing never feels right? I swallowed, suddenly aware of how close the air between us felt, how the quiet house seemed to amplify every heartbeat, every glance. Before I could respond, before I could even untangle my thoughts, The sound of a car passing outside broke the moment. I glanced toward the window, grateful for the distraction. But when I looked back, Ethan was still watching me steady, searching, as if waiting for me to understand something he hadn't yet spoken aloud. And in that moment, I realized his arrival wasn't just about waiting for my son. There was something more, something I wasn't prepared for. The day had begun like any other, but there was something about being home alone that always carried a weight of both peace and unease. My husband was at work. My son had left earlier that morning for his weekend sports practice. And the house, usually filled with the echo of voices, laughter, and footsteps, suddenly felt hollow. The ticking of the clock in the hallway seemed louder, the hum of the refrigerator sharper, and even the sound of my own breath became something I noticed. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the neighborhood. The sun was high, the street was quiet, and yet I couldn't shake the awareness of the emptiness behind me. Being alone can be soothing, giving space to think, to breathe, to simply be. But on days like this, when the silence was too complete, it created a strange tension. It felt as though the walls were listening, as though the air was waiting for something to happen. I glanced around the living room. My son's shoes were still at the door, carelessly kicked aside in his usual rush. A sweater was draped over the back of the couch, and his backpack leaned against the coffee table. The house bore his presence, even though he wasn't there. And in that emptiness, I felt the familiar tug of loneliness. It wasn't sadness, not exactly, but more of an ache, a longing for connection, for warmth. I tried to distract myself. I turned on the television, flipping through channels without settling on anything. I moved into the kitchen, tidied the counter, wiped the already clean surfaces, and opened the fridge though I wasn't hungry. These little rituals filled time, but didn't ease the stillness that pressed against me. Then I sank onto the couch with my coffee, letting myself sink into the quiet. I thought about the life I was living. A mother, a wife, a woman who often put her own desires aside in the name of family. Home alone, I was left with only myself and the thoughts I usually drowned out with the busyness of caring for others. That was when I noticed how the light streamed in through the curtains, highlighting the dust floating in the air like tiny flecks of silver. The sound of a car passing outside startled me slightly, and I realized how attuned I had become to every little noise. There was a heightened sensitivity in being alone. The world outside continued on, but here, within these walls, I was cocooned. In solitude, my mind drifted back to memories of younger years, when I was full of dreams, energy, and a sense of adventure. Back then, being home alone meant freedom, a chance to do whatever I pleased without judgment or interruption. Now, though, it felt different. It wasn't about freedom anymore. It was about the question of who I was when nobody needed me. I walked to the mirror in the hallway and caught my reflection. My hair was slightly undone from the morning rush. My eyes showed faint shadows from sleepless nights. And yet there was still a spark there. Something in my gaze reminded me that I was not just a wife or a mother. I was still me. I smiled, faintly, then turned away, almost embarrassed at my own thoughts. The creak of the house settling made me freeze for a moment. It was silly, really, that being alone sometimes brought irrational fears. I half expected the sound of the front door opening, or footsteps where there should be none. I shook my head, telling myself not to be dramatic, but the truth was, the vulnerability of being alone lingered with me. Time stretched slowly. The clock ticked, the sun moved across the sky, and I lost myself in the rhythm of silence. I thought about my son and how quickly he was growing up. His world was expanding, friends, school, sports, and dreams of his own. One day I knew the house would be quiet, not just for a few hours, but permanently. I wondered how I would feel. That silence, when it came, And then came a thought that unsettled me more than the silence itself. Maybe I was already feeling a glimpse of that future emptiness. Maybe this loneliness wasn't just temporary. It was a reminder of what awaited me down the road. I sighed, shaking myself from that spiral. I picked up a book from the coffee table and tried to read, but the words blurred. My mind wandered. My emotions stirred. It was as if being home alone forced me to face truths I usually buried beneath routine. The doorbell suddenly rang, jolting me upright. The sharp sound cut through the air, shattering the stillness. My heart gave a quick, startled beat. Who could it be? I wasn't expecting anyone. My husband wouldn't be home for hours. And my son, he never rang the bell. He just barged in. Set down my coffee and hesitated. For a moment, I thought of ignoring it. But curiosity and politeness overpowered hesitation. I walked to the door, each step echoing in the quiet hallway. And there, through the window, I caught sight of someone. Standing on the porch, it was my son's friend.